Hello again everyone. So, when I heard that Canon were finally launching a line of their new EOS R cameras, but this time with smaller aps-c sized sensors, I immediately asked my subscribers if they wanted me to get the cheaper R10 model and test the new lenses on a 24 megapixel aps-c sensor, or spend a small fortune on the new EOS R7 with its 32.5 megapixel sensor. Unfortunately for my college fund, everyone said the R7, so I'm clawing back a bit of its cost by making a review of it today. Plus, I wanted to make a video about it anyway because it's been so much fun and so interesting to use. I've come to see it as almost an aps-c Canon EOS R5. And considering it costs less than half the price, it's no wonder everyone's talking about it. As well as using it for lens testing on this channel, it's going to make an excellent backup camera for me for when I'm shooting weddings on my EOS R5. I've missed the YouTube gold rush to get a review of this new camera out as soon as possible, but I wanted to use it a bit first, really get the hang of it so I could get you the best review possible. Also, it took me a few weeks to get hold of one. All my contacts and camera stores tell me it's been a bit of a runaway success for Canon, so let's get stuck in. This R7 camera is a bit of a spiritual successor to the old Canon 7D line of digital SLR cameras. Well, it is in terms of its top performance anyway, but perhaps not quite when it comes to build quality. While the old 7D series of cameras were huge and looked and felt like they were cast out of iron, this R7 camera is just medium sized and actually has a slightly plasticky texture to it. For example, both the Nikon Z50 and my Fuji X-T3 feel a bit tougher and more solidly built. The R7 just doesn't quite feel like a $1,500 camera in the hand initially, but its specs do tell an encouraging story. It's made of robust magnesium alloy and it's strongly weather sealed with dozens of protective seals. Its grip is comfortably large too. I like the new auto manual focus switch on the bottom, and the button within it will stop down your aperture for fine focus tuning. Really useful to me, although that button is also customizable. A few other YouTubers have complained about the top panel switches. Admittedly, I found the ISO button a bit too small and fiddly here, but I didn't really have an issue in use with the on-off switch, which also goes directly to video mode. I found that kind of handy and quick to use, and while that mode dial next to it really should have a locking button, well, this way it is at least a little quicker to use. Likewise, I really had no problem with a new rear dial with center joystick. I have to stretch my thumb a little to turn that dial, but having the joystick right there for moving your focus point is super useful, and my fingers are thin and nimble enough not to have accidentally changed the wrong controls. The camera's screen is a little smaller than that on my Canon EOS R5, but the resolution is still lovely and high, and the screen beautifully bright, far better than any Sony camera I've handled. The screen hinges out as usual for Canon, rather than simply tilting up and down like on some other camera systems. That makes it a little slower to adjust and move around, but considerably more versatile, so I prefer it this way. The camera's touchscreen interface is not something I use much, but it is so handy to have it there nonetheless occasionally, particularly for making certain adjustments during video work. The camera's electronic viewfinder is a nice size to look through, but noticeably lower resolution than the competition. Still good enough though. On the side, we have the usual semi-professional array of connections, remote control and headphone and microphone jacks, useful for video work. Slightly less encouraging is the micro HDMI port rather than a larger sized one, which is no doubt connected to the camera's main board like on the R5, so be really careful not to bump this when you've got a cable plugged in. There's also a USB-C port here which can be used for charging your camera's battery, but only if your charger has power delivery. Talking about power, this camera comes with one of Canon's fabulous LP-E6NH batteries, which are worth their weight in gold. Almost literally, they cost £100, but they give you loads of shooting life, at least about 700 shots in my experience, and a decent amount of video shooting too, up to about 1.5 or even 2 hours. The camera also has two UHS-2 SD card slots, which is always a boon for more serious photographers doing critical work who want a backup. Here is that beautiful aps-c sensor. This camera can shoot at a very impressive 15 frames per second. With a fast SD card in there, and even shooting JPEG plus RAW, you can get an amazing 270 shots off or so before you begin to experience slowdown due to buffering. Fantastic for sports photographers. If you switch to electronic shutter mode, the camera can shoot at an incredible 30 frames per second, but personally I would never bother with that as the sensor readout is slow enough to produce warping. No thanks. Remember, Canon opted for a slightly slower front-side illuminated sensor here, rather than a faster but more expensive backside one. The camera has also inherited the useful option to close the shutter when it's shut down. That's incredibly useful for keeping dust off of your sensor when you're changing lenses, as I do all the time. However, you should still be careful to put your lens cap on if you're using a bright aperture lens, so you don't burn a hole in the thing by accidentally magnifying sunlight onto the shutter mechanism. Also, the camera won't put the shutter down if you're shooting in electronic silent shutter mode. That's about it for the camera's build quality, I think. It has a few little quirks that took me a day or two to get used to, especially after shooting on my Canon EOS R5, which does handle a little better, but the R7 is absolutely fine in use, particularly once you've gotten used to that raised rear dial, which I really do think works quite well. It's a neat compromise. Okay, what about image quality though? Let's see what that challenging 32.5 megapixel aps-c sensor can do, if you can find a camera lens sharp enough to satisfy it, that is. The image on the left is processed from RAW, and on the right, JPEG out of the camera. And yes, I had to use a spectacularly sharp camera lens to get these images, the Sigma 40mm f1.4 Art, stopped down to f5. You can see right away Canon's usual glorious colours and punchy looking JPEGs here. Let's zoom in a little closer. Impressively, we barely see any more detail from the RAW images than from the JPEG here. Both images are looking truly fantastic. Let's increase the ISO levels. I'll keep ISO 100 at the top left for reference. At ISO 800 we're just about beginning to lose a little detail, but only a little. At 1600, a little noise joins in, but the picture still looks quite good, and at 3200, fine detail takes another clear hit. ISO 6400 is the highest I would go to myself. As you can see here, 12,800 and 25,600 are only there so that Canon can include them in the advertised specs. They're pretty useless. But overall, I do love this high-resolution sensor, and it's clearly working with Canon's extremely powerful Digic X processor like a dream. It's not a million miles away from the capabilities of my full-frame Canon EOS R5. With the right camera lens, i.e. not the little zoomable kit lens, and with your aperture stopped down a little, you can capture incredible detail, and the high ISO noise performance is no worse than its lower resolution peers. For example, here are the results from my review of the Nikon ZF-C with its far lower resolution 20 megapixel sensor. Something I should mention though is that if you do have a sharp lens, don't stop it down too much, as this very high resolution sensor is rather diffraction limited. That means that from only about f5.2 or darker, your image quality will slowly begin to get softer as you stop the aperture down. For example, here are some shots taken from the sharpest area of the camera's kit lens, the middle, at the widest angle. On the left, at f5.6, we see fantastic sharpness, but at f8, there's already a bit less contrast and resolution, and the image at f11 has certainly lost its edge. There's no avoiding diffraction though, I'm afraid. That's just the laws of physics for you on very high resolution cameras. By the way, dynamic range is just good on this camera, enabling you to bring down highlights reasonably well, although it doesn't work miracles. Let's move on now and take a look at video quality. Let me tell you a secret. One of my favourite things in the world is the 4K fine mode video quality on my Canon EOS R5 with its stunningly detailed oversampled quality. Well, it's back on the R7, although the camera still has a built-in 30-minute cutoff, annoyingly. Here is some footage with 4K fine mode on the left, standard 4K in the middle, and the camera's 1080p footage on the right. There is a big variance in detail, as you can see, with the 4K fine being clearly way superior, but the 1080p footage admittedly isn't bad for standard high def. Unlike on an EOS R5, the camera in my tests takes a very long time to overheat in 4K fine mode. You get a nice little heat meter showing on your display now, which offers you a lot of strategic shooting reassurance, although in my tests it took 45 minutes for that to even show up on a screen, and it shot for another 90 minutes until the camera's battery gave out. So really, there's no serious problems with overheating unless you're shooting somewhere really hot, and in my opinion, no good reason to ever shoot in anything other than 4K fine mode, unless you want to shoot in 60p. Oh, but wait a minute though, I just remembered in 4K fine mode, the camera does have some real problems with rolling shutter, which are reduced if you shoot in standard 4K mode. So if you're shooting an action scene or some fast panning whip-arounds, then you'll want to temporarily downgrade to standard 4K. Talking about 60p, as I was a moment ago, here are the two 4K 60p modes next to that 4K 25p fine mode for comparison. In standard 4K 60p, we see quite a loss in detail, although I've seen even worse than this before. If you can stomach the resulting 1.81 times crop, then a 4K 60p crop mode on the right looks considerably better, almost as good as the 4K fine mode, although of course you will find it difficult to get any kind of wide angle or narrow depth of field with a crop like that. It's best left for emergencies, or if you deliberately want the broader depth of field or extra magnification that shooting with a further crop will give you. Now, let's see about high ISO video quality. On the left, we see footage at 100 ISO. At 800 ISO, in the middle, we still get a very clean image, albeit with noticeably less detail. At ISO 3200 on the right, some noise and smudgy low detail is getting quite visible now, but still, the footage is surprisingly usable. It's only when we plumb the depths of ISO 6400 and 12800, as you can see here, that more serious issues emerge and the quality starts to get ugly. Still, for an aps-c camera, especially one with such a high-resolution sensor, this is impressive. The camera's powerful Digic X processor is probably doing a huge amount of work to clean up that footage. If you need slow motion, then the camera is capable of shooting at 1080p high definition video at 120 frames per second, and here it is for you. Even though it's only high def, the video quality is actually lovely and sharp. The camera slows the footage down for you automatically after you stop recording. Oh, and one last thing, the camera also offers 10-bit video shooting in camera with Canon C-Log3 footage for getting better dynamic range from your video. That is brilliant for a camera at this price point. Another bonus of the Canon EOS R7, and a big reason why it costs a lot more than the R10, is its built-in image stabilization. I'm so glad Canon finally got out of the dark ages, caught up with the competition, and started offering this feature in their cameras. Here's some footage with a 40mm unstabilized camera lens, and here's the same footage with the R7's in-body stabilization turned on. As you can see, it makes a huge difference. Just a tiny bit of vibration is visible here, and when you tilt and pan the camera, it smooths out your movements very nicely, useful for video work. How about autofocus? Everyone's talking about the R7's blinding autofocus capabilities, and it's all true. Autofocus is always lightning fast with very intelligent and customizable tracking options, not to mention fantastically easy to use. You get eye autofocus, animal eye autofocus, and car tracking autofocus modes, including an option for the camera to try and lock onto the head of the car's driver. Go to your local wildlife park with any telephoto autofocus lens and you'll get perfect images of animals almost every time, and that is so important and useful, especially for tracking birds in flight, and even with third-party lenses. Sometimes it takes a little persuasion for the camera to find the animal in your picture, but when it does, it really is accurate, and you can use the joystick to change from subject to subject. Let's take a look now at some of the camera's shooting modes. We get a built-in intervalometer for shooting time-lapse sequences, always fun and helpful. The now almost ubiquitous anti-flicker shooting mode is present too, being vitally important for sports photographers or event photographers shooting under artificial lighting. HDR-PQ shooting and HEIF modes are available on this camera to help keep it future-proof. But if you were worried that this camera might be a bit too professional, you can also use Canon's old-school creative filters on pictures you've taken. As I've mentioned already, there is a silent electronic shutter mode, which is unbelievably useful for shooting in quiet situations, although again, rolling shutter on action is an issue. An interesting new option is the horizon autocorrection. It rotates the camera's sensor in order to help straighten out your wonky horizons. What a cool idea! Here's some video of me tilting my camera around and the sensor slowly trying to get the horizon back in place, with admittedly mixed results, but it's a feature which might really help some amateur videographers. Well, anyway, even though the camera has loads more specs and options, those are some of the key ones, and I think it's about time to wrap things up. Overall, well, this is a camera that could make me fall in love with aps-c all over again. I particularly love shooting aps-c for video work, by the way. You don't always really need the tiny full-frame depth of field of a full-frame sensor. This way, the camera is easier to work with, more affordable, and the lenses smaller and lighter. aps-c will never die. And I love the R7 because it jumped straight into being a highly accomplished and competitive premium crop sensor camera. It's a joy to use in almost every way, from its good handling to its spectacular 32.5 megapixel sensor, well, if you have a lens sharp enough to give you that kind of resolution, and its wonderful video quality greatly impresses also. If you want to think of it in digital SLR terms, well, when it comes to performance, it's like a 7D series camera on crack, but packed into the body of something a little smaller like the old 70D, and that is absolutely fine by me. If you want a Canon EOS R5 camera, but it's simply out of your price range, then you'll be delighted with this competitively priced aps-c model. Now all we need to do is wait for Canon to bring out a few more aps-c camera lenses, and when they do, I promise you the tests will be coming right up. I love testing aps-c lenses. Okay, I'm going to finish by saying a huge thank you to my generous supporters over on Patreon. It's because of you and your support that I can keep investing in this channel and keep testing this kind of equipment. It's mostly for you that I got hold of this EOS R7 camera. Supporters get to enjoy exclusive bonus content and advanced previews of reviews and other videos, so check out my Patreon page down in the description below, and ciao for now.